A few years after completing the Hand of Thrawn duology, Timothy Zahn was contacted by his editor. Lucas Books and Del Rey wanted to know if he would be interested in writing a book about Outbound Flight. And since this was an opportunity for Zahn to write about his favorite character Thrawn again, he said yes. It was originally supposed to come out in 2002, sort of putting it in the correct timeline since it takes place about 5 years before Attack of the Clones, but instead the release date was pushed back to first November of 2005 and finally January of 2006. Outbound Flight made it to number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list for the week of February 19th, 2006. It was ultimately on the list for 4 weeks. When Outbound Flight came out, I remember that I got it from the library during a break and read it straight through and then proceeded to buy the hardcover copy, and I've reread it several times since then, mainly because Lorana Jinzler is one of my favorite characters. So, a brief summary. The joint Jedi and Republic mission of Outbound Flight is dead in the water until Jedi Master Jorus C'Baoth manages to foil a murderous conspiracy plot and get Outbound Flight back on track. But this mission of colonization and exploration has a deadly enemy in the form of Darth Sidious, who wants the Jedi and the 50,000 colonists on board dead. But they will run into a small kerfluffle in the form of the Chiss Ascendancy and Commander Thrawn, who have distinctly other motives. Alright, 1 minute. That's better. I just didn't think I could be blue for a full 20 minutes. Outbound Flight was first a throwaway line in the Thrawn trilogy by Timothy Zahn. It was more a way of explaining how Thrawn knew that the mad C'Baoth was actually a clone, rather than a distinct story in and of itself. But as Timothy Zahn continued to write Star Wars novels, we got more of its story. And finally, with 2006's Outbound Flight, we got the full story, and a lot of the answers that were left dangling at the end of his sort of sequel, Survivor's Quest, in 2004. But Outbound Flight isn't just the story of that ill-fated mission. It is also, maybe even more so, the first chronological example of Thrawn and how he first came to the attention of Darth Sidious and what the Chiss Ascendancy was like at that point in the prequels. When we first met Thrawn in the Thrawn trilogy, he was decidedly a villain. A very interesting one, but still extremely villainous. But as Timothy Zahn continued to flesh out the characters he had created within Star Wars, Thrawn gets more understandable and less villainous, and your mileage may vary whether that works for you, but here in Outbound Flight, he is, for the most part, a good guy, I guess, the reasonable one, and he already has that strategic mind in place, but you see how it's developing. So, the plot of Outbound Flight. As I said in the summary, as the story opens, Outbound Flight is not going forward. It's sort of stalled out within the bureaucracy of the Republic. Jedi Master Jorus C'Baoth, which it's not a pronunciation I would have guessed looking at that name, but that's how Zahn says it, so okay. Talks to Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, says, what can I do to get this moving again, but being C'Baoth in a very pushy, aggressive way. And he gets sent to Barlock for this negotiations between the corporate sector and the local miners. Meanwhile, Kinman Doriana, who works for Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, but actually secretly works for Darth Sidious, heads to Barlock to do, I don't know, scheming stuff. And meanwhile, Jedi Master Mace Windu sends Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker to Barlock as well. Obi-Wan and Anakin, as well as C'Baoth's Padawan Lorana Jinzler, uncover a plot. They're not able to stop it, but C'Baoth is, and that makes the negotiations go forward. And then he's got enough political capital that Outbound Flight goes through the Senate and is passed and is gonna launch. And that's when we learned from Doriana's viewpoint that that was Sidious's plan all along. He wants some of the troublemaker Jedi to leave on Outbound Flight, and then using the Trade Federation, he's going to attack it and destroy it. Meanwhile, we have a group of 3 Corellian smugglers consisting of the Captain Quento, his first mate / girlfriend Maris Farazi, and their young navigation guy, Jorus C'Baoth, accidentally make their way into the unknown regions, into Chiss territory, and are picked up by Commander Mithra Neruodo, which I'm just going to call Thrawn from now on. Both C'Baoth and Maris end up with this, hero worship crush on Thrawn. Probably the best way to describe it. Thrawn, meanwhile, is focused on, he wants to take out the Vagari, a nomadic, piratical species that's enslaving people in the unknown regions and going around and being bad. But the Chiss, unfortunately, do not approve of preemptive strikes. So Thrawn's going to have to be sneaky if he wants to get rid of the Vagari. Somewhat improbably, Obi-Wan and Anakin are on Outbound Flight, but Sidious panics and so has them taken off before it goes into the unknown regions. And then everything comes to a head where Thrawn encounters the Trade Federation forces. He pretty much wipes them out. Doriana has him speak with Sidious, and he somewhat agrees to deal with Outbound Flight. Using a gravity projector that he stole from the Vagari, he drops Outbound Flight out of space and tries to reason with them to turn around and not go through this part of space. And of course, C'Baoth refuses to do so. And then, because of the same gravity projector and a planned betrayal with C'Baoth, the Vagari show up in the same area, and there's mass chaos ensues where the Jedi attack the Vagari, and Thrawn attacks the Vagari, and then Thrawn attacks Outbound Flight, and it's like, look, I've disabled you, please go away. C'Baoth tries to strangle Thrawn, and then Doriana, not knowing what to do, pushes the big red button, and it kills almost everyone on Outbound Flight, and some of the Vagari are able to get away. While trying to figure out what to do with the remains of Outbound Flight, Aristocrat Formby, who, again, we previously met in Survivor's Quest, as well as the Dark Nest trilogy, shows up, and so they very quickly have to come up with a plan. C'Baoth and Thrass think it's best to try to scuttle the ship, but then they encounter Lorana, who tells them they're survivors and they can't do that, and they try to take it to safety. And then there's this noble, tragic ending in which Thrass and Lorana die to save the survivors, and the survivors will never know, and it's so upsetting. And then everyone gets, pushed around to a proper ending, the end. So let's talk about Thrawn first, because he's probably the most important person here, at least to Zahn. Even though on the cover he's only on the back, I would argue he's more important here than Outbound Flight itself. Zahn gives us a lot of opportunities to see how Thrawn works, that even here, very early in his career, before he even came to the Empire, he is like a chess master, that he moves things into place and usually gets the outcomes he wants. He's able to learn things very quickly, to pick up on things very quickly, but we're never in his head. Instead, we only see Thrawn through mainly C'Baoth's viewpoint, and then later on through Kinman Doriana's. He comes off more fallible here than he will in later stories, and also surprisingly reasonable, maybe excessively so, because he doesn't want to dispose of Outbound Flight at all. He just doesn't want them to continue through Chiss space and possibly run into the far outsiders, who, as we know, are the Yuuzhan Vong. And the only reason that his very reasonable suggestion is disregarded is because we have a complete arrogant idiot like Jorus C'Baoth in charge. We see the scene where he's talking to C'Baoth and Lorana about, please turn around, I don't want to attack you, you need to leave. And Lorana's like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And she also says, what if we try to exit the galaxy through another point? And he's like, that's fine, as long as you're not going through Chiss space. But of course, C'Baoth is such an arrogant ass that he won't listen to this at all. So while Thrawn is very much the ends justify the means, he is not the outright villain that we see in the Thrawn trilogy here. Perhaps because he's younger and he's still working overtly with the Chiss ascendancy, all he cares about is the well-being of the Chiss, even if he has to disregard their rules to do so. And the visitors, the Corellian smugglers who teach Thrawn about the Republic here, of them, Captain Quento is basically just there to be the uncooperative one. The one that does not want to learn, does not want to help, just wants to take his treasure and leave. Maris Farazi is the idealist. She thinks the best of everyone and everything, and I think that fuels a fair bit of her hero worship / crush on Thrawn, is that she sees him as noble and is not able to see that he's a pragmatist and that completely does not align with her worldview. She ends up being like the nice one that everyone, even Thrawn, wants to protect from the truth in the end. Cardass comes across as very, very young. He's only about early 20s, maybe 23. This is his first big job. And I think that too plays into his hero worship of Thrawn, that he sees someone who's just hyper capable and is like, that's so cool, I want to be like that. Of the Chiss, we don't really get a sense of how closely Thrawn and Aralani work together until the end, because her role needs to be concealed so that it comes as a surprise that this was something that Thrawn and she schemed up to take out the Vagari. I will say, if you're interested in more about Aralani, the new canon books are very good here, especially the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy, because you see a lot of their interplay and how their friendship works. Even though she's older than him and she's been able to attain a higher rank, that works to his benefit to sort of shield him from some of the pushback he gets for a lot of his ideas. And then poor Thrass, we hardly knew you, Thrass. He shows up in this book. He just wants the best for his brother and for the 8th ruling family, and if that means turning in his brother and reporting what he's done, he's willing to do it. And he realizes too that he's been played by Thrawn to achieve the ends that Thrawn wanted. And then just the most tragic ending. Every time I read Outbound Flight, what happens to Thrass and Lorana hurts me deeply, because they were just trying to save the survivors, and that ended up meaning that they had to sacrifice themselves to do so, knowing that what they have done will never, ever be found out. Over on the Outbound Flight front, I said it, I'm just gonna repeat it, Jorus C'Baoth, he's the absolute worst. He's just garbage. He's a garbage person. It does surprise me a little that he is this intense and arrogant and completely wrong, because it then does surprise me that Thrawn is willing to use the mad clone C'Baoth, and then it comes across that how the mad clone behaves is less because of his madness and more because that's just how C'Baoth was. He was just the worst. When he falls to the dark side and tries to strangle Thrawn, it's not really a surprise because we've seen him skirting the edge for practically the whole book. He's also the ends justify the means, but his ends aren't particularly good or in line with what the Jedi want to do. And I was surprised he didn't get more pushback from the Jedi on board Outbound Flight, although it sounds like maybe Palpatine manipulated ones who sympathized with C'Baoth to go on Outbound Flight to get them out of the picture, because Master Maning several times says, like, this is wrong, we shouldn't be doing this, but he doesn't confront C'Baoth about it until it's far too late. And Master Maning is really the only one of the other Jedi that we know. There's like 2 unnamed Duros, and then we never see the other ones. There's just too much to cover in 2 little pages here. But Lorana, I really love Lorana. I think that some readers could be frustrated with how passive she is and how much she lets, especially C'Baoth, just steamroll over her, but I think it makes sense for her character, that especially after having been his Padawan for 10 years, maybe more than 10 years, that her poor self-esteem has just become internalized because of the bad way that he's taught her. But at her heart, she's such a good person that she wants to be the best Jedi she can, and she's always trying to serve people, and she's always trying to help. She has a run-in with her brother, Dean Jinzler, before Outbound Flight leaves, and it doesn't go well. He's very bitter about how their parents talked about her. It hurts her deeply, and it's one of the reasons that she agrees to go, because she didn't really choose to go on Outbound Flight. It was more that C'Baoth chose for her. But she's sweet, she's nice, she's kind. You can see how in Survivor's Quest, the survivors who have memories of her think of her fondly, even though they also at the same time are like, well, the Jedi abandoned us. And again, as with Thrass, her tragic, noble sacrifice is just so upsetting to me because she had so much promise. You want the best for her, but events conspire against her. And then Obi-Wan and Anakin. Their presence on the mission on Barlog makes a little more sense than their continued presence on Outbound Flight does. I got the sense from some of the prequel stories, especially from Yoda Dark Rendezvous, that either Lucas books or Del Rey said, you need to have Obi-Wan and Anakin here because this is a prequel story. And so they were included even though it didn't always feel right and feel like it fit the story. And that's the sense I get here, especially because they need to be taken off Outbound Flight before the big confrontation with Thrawn happens. So we have Palpatine himself going all the way out to the very edge of the Outer Rim so he can pull them off. It mainly felt like the only reason they're on Outbound Flight is so we have an explanation behind why that Delta 12 Sky Sprite is on there when Luke and Mara encounter the remains of Outbound Flight in Survivor's Quest. And of the baddies, it's very interesting to me that Kinman Doriana does not know Palpatine's dual role, that he works for Palpatine but also works for Sidious and thinks that what he's doing with Sidious is undermining Palpatine. I guess it is true then that of the people that worked for Sidious, very few knew that he was Palpatine, except for his Sith apprentices like Dooku and Maul and maybe someone like Mos Amida, that even to his minions he keeps that part of himself separate. Doriana has to work with the Trade Federation, who have the resources he needs but are dumb. Convinces Thrawn that he should help them, and then is very conflicted because he needs to kill Thrawn because can't leave any loose ends. You know what happened to Outbound Flight, but also like this guy could be an asset, and ends up not killing Thrawn and being like, hey, you know, if you ever need anything, please contact Sidious. Like, we could work together really well. Kinman Doriana was a name we heard in books, but this was his first appearance, and I think this may have been one of his only appearances because I don't remember encountering him in any of the other stories, but I may look that up on Wikipedia and put a disclaimer down here if that is different. So, for issues, I would say number one is that it is a pretty hefty novel. It is 450 pages, so I did feel like some things could have been tightened up. Like, did we really need to spend so much time on that mission to Barlog, particularly when it felt like the things with Outbound Flight got truncated as a result? And part of that too may just be Zahn choosing to spend so much time on Thrawn means that so much of the book is dedicated to Thrawn, even when he's not doing things interesting, when he's just doing language classes with Maris and with Cardass. And two, I wonder if excluding Anakin and Obi-Wan from the plot would have meant that some of the other Jedi on board Outbound Flight could have been further developed, because as it was, there's 6 Masters and 12 Jedi Knights, but we really only know 3 of them. But I think my biggest issue with Outbound Flight is the way that Zahn tries to tie it in with the stories that are to come, especially with the new Jedi Order series and the Yuuzhan involved. When Doriana is trying to convince Thrawn that he should attack Outbound Flight for him, he first says a lot of garbage / half-truths about the Jedi, but then he comes out with more information, which is that there are invaders from another galaxy who are in the unknown regions right now, and they use biotechnology, and they are a great threat to the galaxy as a whole. And he calls Sidious and has Sidious talk to Thrawn about this. Seems to imply that this is one of Sidious's motivations in taking down the Republic and building up his new order so they could be strong enough to face this threat. And then at the end, Thrawn says that the Chiss know about the Far Outsiders because Aralani herself encountered a force of them. And so the Chiss taking out the Vagari was just them doing some tidying up before reckoning with these Far Outsiders who are lurking out there. And here's the thing. I do think that Thrawn wanting to build the Chiss up against this threat from the Yuuzhan Vong sort of makes sense for Thrawn's character, because he's always focused on what is best for the Chiss, even if they don't think that's the best for themselves. But to make that also Sidious's motivation as well troubles me. I 100% can accept that Sidious would know about the presence of the Yuuzhan Vong, and maybe he would think that's a good way to motivate Thrawn into his service, because that's something Thrawn's concerned about, so then Sidious would make it something that he's concerned about. But I don't buy that Sidious is actually concerned about it at all, because, I don't know, he just seems so concerned with power and taking power for himself, and I don't think that he would really care about the Yuuzhan Vong at all, because then it also makes everything that the rebellion does, like, counterproductive. Like, if Sidious took over the Republic and made it an empire and strengthened everything specifically so they can stand up against the Vong, then the rebellion overthrowing a tyrannical empire means that they put the events in motion that led to the Yuuzhan Vong invasion and Coruscant being taken over and worlds being destroyed and billions and billions and billions of galactic residents being dead. That the rebellion made things worse. And I don't accept that. This small chapter just has so many ramifications for things to come, and it makes things completely worse. Maybe we should have left Palpatine in power and then he could have dealt with the Yuuzhan Vong, but like, I can't accept that because he's evil. The more you think about this, the more you're like, this makes things very ethically and morally murky. So, in short, if you came out of 2004's Survivor's Quest wanting to know answers to all those questions that were left dangling, in fact, you may even get answers to questions you didn't even have at the end of Survivor's Quest. I think it's interesting to see a young Thrawn who is already a strategic genius, but is definitely growing into his skills at a time when he's not overtly villainous and he's trying to do the right thing. Although I do question if perhaps Zahn made him a little too reasonable at times. I do think the story could have been tightened up a fair bit, especially if the whole Anakin Obi-Wan plotline hadn't been there, but I enjoyed revisiting it, even if the end, as it always does, made me cry. So, next time, I listened to all of y'all in the comments who were like, why don't you read this book? This book has so many insights and tells you so much about the prequels. So, we are jumping ahead, significantly, to 2012 with Darth Sidious's origin story in Darth Plagueis by James Luceno.